This course deals with negotiating learner differences and how we might come and move towards productive diversity in learning. I do one of the sections which is about the historical context in which issues of diversity have been dealt with differently in different epochs in time. Bill Cope then deals with theories of race and diversity that pertain to education context. James Anderson looks at race and culture in the American context and how that's been played out in complex ways. And Christopher Spann asks the question, is education a right? And how does that deal with those who've been included and excluded over time? Bill Trent introduces us to the issues relating to formal segregation, desegregation, and resegregation as a consequence of different trends. Yoon Pak, she deals with the more multicultural aspects of diversity issues with a particular emphasis on Asian communities. And Cameron McCarthy, he examines post-colonial impacts on concepts of race and culture and their impact on education.
We're lucky to have here in the College of Education some leading thinkers, leading researchers, leading theorists around notions of learner diversity and the ways in which education systems deal with that. And what you're going to hear across each of these people are very different voices, very different perspectives, so different, in fact, that you might think they're almost talking different languages. Mary and I come from Australia where these things are talked about in different kinds of ways, but there's also in this course a very strong sense of an American perspective, a US perspective, and when we come to Cameron McCarthy, a general post-colonial perspective. So Mary kicks off the course with a general introduction to the global historical phenomenon of human movement and the consequences of human movement in schools and in classrooms. What I do in the next section is I try and deal theoretically with the concepts around learner differences. So, we often have this kind of shopping list of differences: race, gender, ethnicity, disability, goes on and on and on. But we really need to think about them analytically, and we try here to define these in more detail. Again, there's further detail in a paper that we provide in the course and also in some of the things that Mary and I have written. We go on in that and talk about different forms of exclusion, the difference between exclusion and assimilation, and something that we call a more inclusive education, which is what are the ways in which we bring these differences together. And we also try to introduce a more general concept that we call life world differences. The demographic differences are so complicated that in fact we end up talking in another way about what's the composite of experience that goes behind learner differences. Getting now very in a kind of a serious, in-depth way in a series of 3 different speakers speaking about the US situation. We have an introduction from James Anderson, a very famous historian of American education. And what he does is he talks about the general framework of changing US demographics and social mobility, some fundamental issues which have arisen in the US context. Another historian in our college is Christopher Spann, and he begins by talking in quite detailed ways about the origins of modern education in the US in particular states, initially in Virginia, in Massachusetts, North and South Carolina, and talks about the way in which a certain kind of promise is made in the US education system. Moving on from these kind of historical analyses, we have Bill Trent, who speaks about some very vexed concepts in the American context, which is the realities of segregation, the project of desegregation, how this is different from something that's called integration, and more recently about what are the contemporary dynamics of what he calls resegregation around neighbourhoods, inequality, different qualities of schooling. Again, staying with the American context, we now have Yoon Pak, who speaks about a particular set of ethnic dynamics, focusing in her case on Asian Americans, who in some ways seem to be overperforming, outperforming other ethnic groups. But on the other hand, there are all kinds of residual issues of racism and discrimination for those groups as well. Finally, in the kind of substantive contributions to this course, we have Cameron McCarthy. He originally hails from the West Indies, and he will talk about post-colonialism. So, how does a post-colonial critique think through these historical dilemmas of rich countries that have dominated poor countries and the whole dynamic of colonialism? There's a small conclusion by Mary and me around some of these ideas of diversity, how we try and bring these together. Now, what you will have experienced in the course by the end are very, very diverse voices, very diverse disciplinary perspectives, diverse concepts. So really it's over to you as the learners to make of this what you will, to fill in the gaps, to try and think, how does this apply to my situation if you're not in the US? If you're in the US, how do the concepts which come from Mary and me as Australians and Cameron as a post-colonial theorist, how do they apply in the US context?